You know, as I was listening to Michael talk about all those issues, I could only think, I hope he's asked the other guys to talk about some of that stuff. But Michael called me Monday afternoon and said, I'd like you to talk about four things. Talk about some of the hard truths, some of the realities about energy. Talk about what you believe a comprehensive energy policy or plan would look like. Some perspective on CCS. As Michael just said, I think all of us at some stage are involved in it and understand the importance of it. And then lastly, what is sort of the state of play for U.S. energy climate legislation and regulation? So I'd begin with sort of the first hard truth, and that quite simply, no surprise to any of you, is that the global demand for energy is going to continue to increase. And it's driven, obviously, by the large increase in population, from about 6.6 billion people today to somewhere between 8 to 9 billion people by 2030. And as we all recognize, most of that growth will be in the developing or non-OECD countries. Now, if you look at what the International Energy Agency says about demand, they project that demand will increase about 40% between 2007 and 2030. And again, as you would expect, with essentially all of that growth coming from the developing countries. And again, just to put that in context, that's the equivalent of adding 2 United States to global energy consumption. IEA believes that meeting that demand will require somewhere between $25 and $30 trillion, again, with a good part of that investment occurring in the developing countries. And again, when you think about how important it is to raise that standard of living in the developing countries, there's 1.5 billion people today. Over 20% of the world's population still lacks access to electricity. The second hard truth, and it's one certainly I think a lot of folks in the U.S. are still trying to come to grips with, there's no silver bullet solution. There's nothing that's going to render fossil fuels obsolete tomorrow or will make renewables suddenly technically and commercially viable and available technically and commercially around the globe. That doesn't happen overnight. There's no question renewable energy is an essential and growing part of our future energy mix. And I think, as Michael said, Marathon is indeed investing in both conventional and unconventional advanced biofuels. But the fact is, all the world's biomass, wind, solar, wave, tide, geothermal energy today accounts for about 10% of global energy supply. If you look at what the IEA projects going forward, in their base case, they say those forms of energy will increase to only 12% of total demand. Fossil fuels will still be 80%. They, of course, have a more aggressive emissions reduction case, which they say the renewables will comprise 19% of total demand, and fossil fuels about 68%. And I know for a lot of people that's frustrating. You say, why in the world, 20 years from now, do fossil fuels still represent such a high percentage of global energy? But it really is, again, an issue that people tend to not understand or underestimate, and that is the global scale of the energy business, what it takes in terms of infrastructure to deliver energy on a global basis, reliably, affordably. The last truth that I want to touch on is really how tough this challenge is when we talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. You know, we've all seen legislation, certainly in Washington, being debated that targets reductions in U.S. greenhouse gas emissions of about 17% by 2020 and 83% by 2050. You know, I don't know about you, but I have a hard time understanding what 17% or 83% reduction means. So let me try to frame it up for you. If we were theoretically able to replace all of today's global transportation system with a no-carbon solution, that's all the cars, trucks, buses, airplanes, trains, and ships, we would reduce greenhouse gas emissions by only 15%. If we were to replace our entire global power generation system, we would reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 25%. So the complete transformation of our global power generation and transportation infrastructure, clearly no small task, would achieve only a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So again, I think it's important we all understand the complexity, the magnitude of the task before us. And I have said many times, and I truly believe, what we face in terms of achieving long-term energy security, sustainability, and competitiveness is tougher than putting a man on the moon, as we did 40 years ago. What do I think a viable energy policy plan would look like? Again, it's pretty clear there's no silver bullet, there's no single energy solution that meets our needs. But I see three key elements that need to be part of that plan. First and foremost, greater energy efficiency and conservation. It's the cheapest, fastest means of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The beauty of it is, we talk a lot, and I will later, about technology, but there's no new technology needed. Today, we have the ability to manufacture far more efficient vehicles, certainly in terms of buildings, appliances, much more energy efficient in manufacturing. You know, a lot of different numbers out there. McKinsey just put out some numbers that said by 2020, we could reduce global energy demand by 20%, over 20%, by making investments today that are economic, don't need a cost of carbon, simply makes sense based on today's energy prices. The second key strategy is the need to diversify and increase the sources of our energy. This means we don't need our elected officials picking winners and losers. We're going to need all the energy sources available to us, and we're going to need more of them. And third, the need for innovation and the deployment and development of new technologies. I see really three objectives of new technology. The first is to allow us to use our energy more efficiently. The second is to increase the sources of our energy and make them more economic. And third is to minimize the environmental impact of our energy usage. I'd also say in a plan, we need to understand that which we can do immediately and that which will take time. Right away today, we could have an immediate focus on a great deal more energy efficiency and conservation. We could also focus a lot more on increased use of natural gas to displace some of the dirtier fuels that we're using today. Now, Michael asked me to comment briefly on, again, carbon capture and sequestration. Now, Marathon is a participant in the Quest project at the Athabasca Oil Sands project in Alberta. And we all recognize some of the challenges around CCS, but from our standpoint, this is a very critical technology for the future. But one of the key challenges that you face here, and we need to all understand it, is that when you look at the flue gas streams that come from plants, the content of CO2 emissions is fairly small. For example, in a pulverized coal power plant, only about 12% of the flue gas is CO2. In a natural gas power plant, it's only about 4% CO2. So there's a great deal of investment that needs to be made to aggregate a large enough volume of gas to get a concentrated stream of CO2. And when you begin looking at what some of those capital costs are, putting aside any investment in sequestration, our numbers would suggest for a pulverized coal plant, $810 million per 1 million ton per year of sequestered CO2, and for a gas power plant, because there's a lower concentration, it's about $1.8 billion per million tons per year sequestered. So again, that's a huge cost challenge, not a science challenge, a cost and logistics challenge that we face in CCS. And we roll all that up. From our standpoint, looking at a pure CCS project, not subsidized, we believe it probably takes somewhere around $100 a ton to make that an economic investment. Let me close out with a little bit of the state of play in terms of Washington around U.S. energy and climate legislation and regulation. From a legislative standpoint, we've all witnessed now the health care bill passed. They're now turning their attention to financial reform, but not far behind that is energy and climate. There is no appetite in the Senate for the Waxman-Markey type approach, which basically picked winners and losers in terms of energy. What we see today is in the Senate, 3 senators, Kerry, Lieberman, and Graham, trying to move forward with an energy climate bill that involves a lot of cooperation and input from both industry and the environmental groups. And it basically recognizes the importance of all of our energy sources, permits more access to new areas, has a cap and trade beginning for utilities in 2012, manufacturing in 2016, and other units at a later time than that, and would, again, keep from having the greenhouse gas emissions regulated under the Clean Air Act, which is the other initiative that's certainly underway today. I'm sure there'll be some questions about it, the endangerment finding from the EPA. I'll simply tell you, that's the one outcome no one wants, because administering greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act is not going to be easy, and it will create a lot of problems for all segments of society. It's important to get to a legislative solution. I'd say the odds this year of a legislative solution are pretty slim, but a lot of people are working hard on it. So with that, Michael, I think I've teed up some issues and turn it over to the next speaker.